idea is to ensure that we are able to put up a very strong perspective on how we can bridge research and policy, and that's something Southcentre is all about. I mean, we are not totally a research agency and we are not an advocacy group, but what we do very best is that we can find solutions which are politically workable, and when you are sitting on a negotiation table, right across north and south, you have to produce solutions which will get digested and there's something which can come out with it. And that is basically what Southcentre is all about. And the presentation which I'm going to give is on, it relates to one of the major issues of our times, and that's climate change, which is affecting everyone. The title is Breaking the Deadlock on Climate Change Related Technology and what Southcentre proposes to do about it. We all know that climate change affects everyone. It doesn't have, or it doesn't respect any national boundaries. It doesn't respect the race. It affects everyone. So it's important that we come up with some kind of solution by which we are able to provide some answer on how we can manage this issue. Now, my focus of the presentation will be fivefold. The very first, I'll just talk about what are the climate change related technology. Secondly, I would like to illustrate what is the current deadlock right now. I mean, what is something where Southcentre needs to intervene with all its research programs. Thirdly, how climate stability, when viewed from the lens of global public goods, can provide us with some kind of a solution. Number four, I want to bring out what would be the right proposal which we want to proceed with. And finally, the conclusion. Now, as we all know, technology transfer is a kind of a diffusion of new technologies as well as the software part, the know-how. It's not just the technology, but how do you apply the technology in the local context, and the whole package is what I would define as technology transfer. And it has to be based on the fact that the recipient country who receives the technology is able to scale up the technology, is able to apply it commercially, and at the end of the day, he or the country gets the value for what the country has paid for. Now, in terms of the climate change related technology, there have been repeated calls made by the international community that there has to be a technology transfer from the north to the south. Now, this started long time back. I mean, and some of the milestones are on the slide. And in the Rio, in the UNCED, there was a call on transfer of technology and greater cooperation on this issue. Again, on the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was again a call for promoting diffusion and transfer technology. In the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, there was again this call that there should be reduced barrier to diffusion. And finally, as latest in the recently concluded UN General Assembly, there was still renewed commitment that yes, countries should go in for transfer of technology. So there is no doubt that there is a common understanding at the global level that this is one of the way forward. So, but what's the status of transfer of technology when it comes to climate change? And this is a very interesting picture. First of all, I mean, there are very proven and robust technologies which can make an impact. I mean, when we talk making an impact, which means there are technologies which can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, these technologies are available in wide range of sectors like energy supply, transport, industry, agriculture. More importantly, these technologies are already being put into action in the north. I mean, you have things like energy efficient devices, the use of renewable energies, wind farms, solar panels, hybrid vehicles, you name it. I mean, they are being applied and they have a big role in checking our greenhouse gas emissions. But the sad part is that even though the technologies exist and they are being deployed, but when it comes to the south doesn't have access to it. And when I talk about the south, I mean more than the geographical south. I mean the political constituency of the G77 group of nations. I mean that's the big chunk of countries which do not have access of this kind of technology. So what is the fundamental issue? The fundamental issue is that it's an issue of transfer of technology more than the existence of technology. So there is a clear deadlock which is existing. The deadlock is that the transfer of technology between the north private sector is not going to the south private sector. The north industries are not able to transfer fully the technologies to the south industries. So there is a diffusion problem on one end, and on the other end, the environmental problems are growing. Every day there is a greater damage which we are doing to the environment in spite of having technologies which can curb this kind of a damage. So there is a problem of the transfer of technologies between the north industry to the south industry. Now I would like to move slightly different way, and I would like people to wear the lens of global public good. And that is, if we try to look from the lens of global public good, we will find that climate stability is a real global public good. In the sense, it's public in consumption, it has all the characteristics of a public good, which is non-exclusivity, non-rivalry. Secondly, the benefits are global in nature, as I told earlier, that everyone can benefit from it. But as in the case of public goods, the markets do not provide for optimal provision of this good. There is always a market failure, which means that the good is underprovided. And in this case, it's clear that the human-made greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow, and they have made the climate unstable. Now, when the markets fail, that there is a clear reason for the states to intervene in the process. And when we talk about the global public good, there is no equivalent of state. What happens at the national level, there is no state at the supranational level. So the idea is that we need to go in for international cooperation, that we have to get countries together to ensure that the global public good is adequately provided. Now, one has to take into the notion that climate stability is not something which one country can produce on its own. I mean, you can go and invade a country unilaterally, but you can't actually end up providing global public good just on your own. What it follows is a kind of a summation process. Each country will have to produce the good collectively, and when it adds up, we will have a climate stability. So it cannot be produced something like a global positioning system, that one country produces and everybody benefits from it. No, it has to be produced collectively. So that's something which I want to reinforce at this time. Saying that there is a common responsibility for all countries, but then there is also a differentiated responsibility. In the sense, since all countries are not equally to blame about climate change, that means the responsibility lies more strongly on certain group of countries versus the others. And this leads to the conclusion that North, which has been more responsible for producing climate instability, first of all should try to meet its own commitments on how it can curb its greenhouse gas emissions. And secondly, since it cannot provide this good on their own and they have to buy in from the South, that the South also has to participate in the process, they have to give adequate incentives for the South to come into the process. And this incentive now links back to the presentation that transfer of technology can be a very good incentive which can bring in the participation of the global community. The mechanism can check greenhouse gas emissions, it can induce the participation of the South, and more importantly, there is a precedent of this kind of incentive providing the desired result. And that precedent is the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol, I don't know how many of us know about it, but it was aimed at reducing the ozone hole. Everyone must have heard about the widening ozone hole. And the idea was that the ozone hole is caused by some ozone depleting substances which are found in use of chlorofluorocarbons in aerosols, in perfumes. And the idea was how you can prevent ozone hole from widening or for enlarging. Now, in this particular issue also, it was mostly the developed countries, the North, which had a very high usage of this ODS content. Secondly, there were effective technologies or substitutes available in the North, which could prevent this ODS depletion. Transfer of technology from North to South was very slow, and South was very reluctant to bear the cost because it was not responsible for this damage. Now, in this case, there was a framework which was adopted, and this framework was called the Montreal Protocol framework, and it had three key components in them. The first component was the technical component, the second was the institutional, and the third was the financial component. Now, what this framework did was it tried to identify, okay, these are the sets of technologies or the basket of technologies which we should promote or which we should transfer from the north to south and which can prevent the use of these ozone depleting substances. Now, some of the technologies were, using liquid carbon growing technology, use of CFC substitutes, ozone-friendly aerosols. But in this case, also, there was a market failure because private sector could not provide all the technologies, or it could not transfer all the technologies from the north to south. And the government, the north government, actually entered into the protocol in a big way, and they became one of the major stakeholders, and they provided a kind of a coordination and facilitation of a national level response on how to deal with this issue. So what it finally did was it created the multilateral fund for implementation of Montreal Protocol. Now this was a kind of a fund which was contributed by the developed countries, and it had two key objectives. Number one, to ensure that the best technologies were transferred in the fastest possible manner, and secondly, to ensure that the South is able to buy into this process. So this particular fund, it distributed over $2 billion at 1997 prices and to over 140 developing countries, and it resulted in phasing out of over 60% of ozone depleting substance from developing countries. So what it did was it bore all the incremental costs which developing countries had to face to switch from ozone non-friendly technology to ozone-friendly technology. Secondly, it was able to fund the cost of actual technology transfer. In some cases, it actually paid for the royalty and license fees for the new technologies which were being developed. And if, for example, even the USA was one of the major contributors to the fund, and they were a part which sponsored this transfer of technology. So what are the lessons from this interesting framework which happened, and which was a very successful protocol? It is cited as one of the major successful environmental frameworks of our times, which actually started in the proposal was ratified in 1989, and the fund was created in 1990, and obviously you can see how much benefits have started to accrue from this protocol. So the lessons are that there should be a binding framework for industrialized countries, and these industrialized countries were able to adhere to this framework both domestically as well as for their international commitments. Secondly, it was the government proved as a major stakeholder in the process, and it is them who acted as the facilitator of transfer of technology between northern industries to the southern industries. And lastly, it provided very clear incentives that it bore all the incremental costs for the South. So finally I come that what is the proposal we want to pursue for the South when it comes to the climate change, not for the South, but what is the proposal we have for breaking this deadlock. We want to expand the Montreal Protocol into the climate change issues. In the Montreal Protocol, the key substance or the key technology was the ozone-friendly technology, and now we want to expand it to include 5 further technologies which can impact positively on climate stability. So the idea is very clear. You have to have a basket of technologies which can prove or which can provide climate stability. Now that's number one, and identify from this basket which are those technologies which are not available in the South. Secondly, once we have identified which are the technologies which can make the maximum impact, the role of the governments have to come in. The governments have to prove to be an important player, the North government and the South government, because we understand that this is being a global public good. The markets themselves will not be able to provide a solution. And thirdly, there has to be a financial kind of an arrangement. And again, we can actually use the lessons from the Montreal Protocol on how we can have a kind of a similar financial arrangement for climate stability. Now, in this chart, the idea is to show that to North governments to buy or to procure technologies from the northern industries. And there is a clear reason for doing so, because often most of the patents are being developed through public funded research, which gets licensed at a very nominal cost to the northern industries. And that's one of the reasons why the governments have equal right to procure back these technologies and provide it to the South government, who in turn can pass it on to the South industries. And that would lead to a much stronger flow of technologies from the northern industries to the southern industries. So these are some of the common instruments which are available with the government, provided they are willing to act in a very stronger way. There are carrots, there are sticks, and then governments can enter into a public-private partnership to ensure that the technologies are provided in a very favorable conditions at a very favorable price. And finally, we should not forget that there are other ways which have come up after the Montreal Protocol, which can reduce this cost of providing this global public good. And one of the major things they can do is to finance development of technologies in the South. That's number one. And secondly, financing the South-South cooperation, because transfer cost of technologies when it comes from one southern country to the other southern country is much less compared to what has been the traditional flow of technologies from the north to the south. So the conclusion is that even though the deadlock is existing on the transfer of technology, but there is a way out from this deadlock because the technologies exist, and secondly, there is a clear responsibility on certain group of countries to provide for this transfer of technology. Then we already have a precedence of Montreal Protocol, and which we can now apply to this wider or broader situation of climate stability. And lastly, governments have to show much more urgency, especially the governments which are more to blame for the situation. They have to show the same level of urgency which they showed for the ozone depleting substances to make an impact. Thank you.